a man accidentally contacted his father, who had been dead for 30 years, through a radio. At first, both sides thought it was a prank, until the father accidentally set the shoe polish next to him on fire, and a scorch mark immediately appeared on John's desk. Frank mistook John for a pervert lurking in the shadows and warned him to stay away from himself and his family. Although John did not understand what was happening, he could be sure that the person on the other end was indeed his father from 30 years ago, and Frank was set to die in a fire the next day. John didn't bother to explain. He hurriedly warned his father not to trust his instincts the next day, and to take a different route to avoid death. At this moment, the signal suddenly cut off, and they lost contact. The next day, Frank, who went to the fire station, found that the situation at the baseball game was exactly as John had described, and the warehouse John had warned him about did indeed catch fire. Everything matched John's predictions perfectly. This made Frank, who had always thought he was dealing with a madman, start to have some doubts. At the fire scene, after finding the trapped girl, the ladder suddenly malfunctioned, the gears jammed, and it couldn't reach the window to rescue them. Frank had to find another way out himself, instinctively choosing a path with less fire. But just as Frank walked into it, he remembered John's warning and decisively turned back to take another route. Here, Frank found a slide, and he slid down from the top floor with the girl, escaping the building and falling into the river to survive. On the anniversary of his father's death, a flood of new memories suddenly rushed into John's mind. Unable to grasp the truth, John hurried to find Gordo to confirm. Sure enough, Frank did not die in the fire but died of lung cancer 10 years ago. John was very surprised. He had indeed changed history. He immediately ran home to check the newspaper from the year his father died, and the report had changed to his father successfully saving the trapped girl. At this point, Frank finally believed that John on the other end of the radio was indeed his son from 30 years into the future. Earlier, Frank had called out to John without getting a response, so he left a message on the desk for John. When John saw it, he immediately replied to his father through the radio. They were both shocked by this incredible miracle. They talked late into the night across 30 years of time before reluctantly hanging up. After disconnecting from his father, John hurriedly called his mother, but she did not answer. So, John left a voice message saying he had some good news to tell her. That same night, Frank, who had escaped death, went to the hospital where his wife Julia was working the night shift. Ready to see her, they didn't know that the future would be rewritten once again. Just as Frank was boldly confessing his love to his wife, Julia inadvertently noticed that a colleague had given the wrong medication to a patient, so she quickly stepped in to prevent the tragedy, and it was this action that would trigger a new series of butterfly effects. That night, while John was sleeping, fragments of memories suddenly emerged in his mind again. It seemed to be the scene of him attending his mother's funeral when he was a child. Upon waking, John hurriedly called his mother. To his surprise, the call was answered by a restaurant. So, John quickly went to the place where his girlfriend Samantha worked to figure out what had happened. To John's further surprise, Samantha didn't recognize him at all. With multiple memories, John seemed unable to distinguish which one was real. He apologized to his girlfriend and left in a hurry. Back at the police station, Satch approached John with a case file. It turned out that in the past few decades, there had been a serial killer on the loose, and not long ago, they had unearthed the skeleton of a woman. Counting this, she was already the 10th victim. Upon hearing this, John was puzzled again. He remembered there being only 3 victims, so he quickly checked the file. To John's horror, not only had the number of victims increased to 10, but his mother was also among them. Shaken by this series of memories, he hurried home and reconnected with his father. John told him about his mother's murder. According to the file, his mother was murdered on December 22, 1969, and the killer was never caught. Moreover, the killer had previously murdered 3 other women. Without exception, these women were all nurses. The killer was known as the Nightingale Killer. John speculated that perhaps their actions had altered history, turning the original 3 victims into 10. John asked his father if he had done anything that might have affected all this. Hearing this, Frank was already in a state of panic. He thought for a long time and finally realized that the night he survived, he went to the hospital to visit his wife. John immediately pointed out that this was where the problem occurred. According to the original timeline, after the father died in the fire, the mother would leave the hospital upon receiving this tragic news. Perhaps something happening in the hospital changed everything. Hearing this, Frank wanted to hurry and bring his wife home. thinking this might change her fate. But John questioned what they should do about the other victims. Frank fell silent. They didn't know what the killer looked like, and even if they reported it to the police, no one would believe them. Just when they were at their wits' end, John suddenly came up with an idea. He took out the case file and told his father that although they didn't know who the killer was, they could hide around the victims to find the killer. Then they could call the police. John then read the information on the earliest victim to his father. This victim was a woman named Carrie. So, on the day of the crime, Frank followed the clues to Corsi Bar. According to the information, Carrie would arrive there at 6:30 p.m., leave at 7:30 p.m., and die in a nearby alley at 8 p.m. Frank just needed to watch who followed Carrie. Unexpectedly, not only did he identify Carrie, but due to his handsome appearance, Carrie and her friend invited him for drinks. Perhaps because Frank was chatting with them, the killer couldn't find a chance to strike, thereby changing Carrie's fate. Sure enough, the next day when John checked the file again, Carrie's information had disappeared. It seemed this method was indeed feasible. In the evening, John told his father that Carrie was still alive and that they might really catch the serial killer this way. As they were talking, Frank's wife walked in. Frank hurriedly pulled Julia over to say hello to John, but he didn't reveal John's true identity. Hearing his young mother's voice, John was very emotional, and he subtly expressed his love for her. Then little John and Gordo came over as well. After exchanging greetings through the radio, John decided to give Gordo a big gift. He told Gordo to remember a word.
Yahoo.
What's that?
Well, it's a magic word. It's like,
John told Gordo to not only write down the word, but to memorize it. After everyone else went to sleep, John and his father continued to prepare the next step of their plan. This time, the latest victim was named Sissy, also a nurse, but after work, she worked part-time as a bartender. She was to be murdered at home in the early hours around 2 a.m. Listening to his son's account, Frank took note of all the information. John reminded him to always be careful and to prioritize his safety, because John didn't know how long this cross-time connection would last. Soon, Frank followed the clues to the bar, but his presence aroused Nightingale's suspicion, because Frank kept wandering around the target. Nightingale had to suspect that Frank was following him. So, when Frank went to the restroom, Nightingale attacked him. Although Frank was in good physical condition as a fireman and fought back against Nightingale, he was still knocked out by Nightingale in the end. Clearly, this killer was no ordinary person. Nightingale not only took Frank's driver's license but also prepared to strangle him with a rope. Fortunately, others showed up unexpectedly and interrupted Nightingale. Nightingale pretended to be Frank's friend and dumped him in the restroom. When Frank woke up, he hurried to Sissy's house, but he found that Sissy had already been murdered. Upon returning, Frank told John about this and mentioned that the killer had taken his driver's license, possibly knowing his home address. Frank was worried about retaliation, but John suddenly asked if the wallet had been taken. Frank said no. John told his father that the wallet must have the killer's fingerprints. He needed his father to wrap the wallet in a bag and hide it somewhere it wouldn't be found for 30 years. After thinking it over, Frank hid the wallet under the partition of a wooden box. Meanwhile, John successfully retrieved the wallet and excitedly told his father. John then approached a colleague, and through fingerprint matching, he identified the killer as a man named Jack. Unexpectedly, Jack was also a police officer and still alive. John went to Jack's house to investigate but found that he wasn't there. From Jack's father's account, John learned that Jack's mother was a nurse who had also been brutally murdered. Hearing this, John seemed to realize something. John followed the clues and found Jack at the bar, then deliberately brought up the Nightingale killer case. Claiming he had a lead on the killer, John said that this guy even killed his own mother to divert police attention. Hearing this, Jack seemed indifferent, so John pointed at Jack, saying he was the killer, though the current evidence wasn't enough to convict him. But John was not going to let him get away with it for 30 years. Back home, John asked his father to anonymously report Jack as the Nightingale killer and point out the victim's burial sites. This way, the police would surely search Jack's house, because Jack had a habit of collecting the victim's jewelry. As long as the police found it, they could convict him directly. They could make sure Jack faced justice 30 years earlier. Unexpectedly, just as John finished saying this, Frank's friend Satch suddenly walked in. Satch was the mentor who led John into the police profession. His arrival disrupted John and his father's plan. The police had found Frank's driver's license at the crime scene of the deceased Sissy. It was obviously left there by the killer to frame Frank. Frank tried to explain, but all his arguments seemed weak. Satch asked Frank to come back to the station for a talk. As they were leaving, Frank quickly told his son about his current predicament. This made Satch think Frank was signaling to an accomplice. During their argument, the radio accidentally fell and broke, severing John's connection with his father. At the station, Frank told Satch that he had accidentally contacted his son 30 years in the future via the radio and that they were working together to catch the serial killer. Moreover, the killer was a police officer. Faced with this outlandish story, Satch couldn't possibly believe it. Even Frank himself found it hard to believe after explaining it. Just as Frank was at a loss, he suddenly heard the sound of a baseball game from the next room. Frank remembered the game details and results his son had told him, so he described the game's process and outcome in detail to Satch. But after hearing it, Satch still thought Frank was making excuses. Not long after, the real killer, Jack, arrived at the station. When Satch was away, Jack tried to kill Frank under the guise of an assault on an officer. Luckily, others arrived and stopped Jack. After Jack temporarily left, Frank realized that with Satch gone, he had to find a way to save himself. As a firefighter, Frank quickly came up with a plan. He ripped the wires off the wall and tied them separately to the metal grid and the doorknob. Then, he found a live power source. Next, he poured coffee on the floor by the doorway. After setting up, Frank returned to his seat. At this moment, Jack came back to Frank's location while everyone else was watching the baseball game. When he stepped on the coffee, Frank threw out the electrified wire. In an instant, Jack was knocked unconscious. Frank hurriedly took out Jack's identification and found his address. Then he took the lighter from Jack's pocket and found some insecticide to make a makeshift flamethrower. With the fire alarm triggered, Frank took the opportunity to slip out. On the other side, Satch was asking Julia if Frank had been acting strangely lately. At that moment, the baseball game on the nearby TV caught his attention. It was exactly as Frank had described. When the game ended, Satch finally believed that Frank wasn't lying. Meanwhile, Frank had found Jack's house based on the address, but he couldn't find any evidence after searching for a long time. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the door opening. Frank knew Jack was back, so he quickly hid. Through a crack, Frank saw Jack nervously checking a specific spot. It seemed that this was where the victim's memorabilia was hidden. After Jack walked away, Frank seized the opportunity to take the items down. When he opened it, he saw that it was indeed filled with the victim's belongings. Before Frank could react, Jack suddenly appeared and started shooting at him. Fortunately, Frank reacted quickly, crashing through the window and jumping out. Using his agility, Frank not only dodged the bullets but also quickly reached the ground. Jack saw this and quickly chased after him. After they left, Satch arrived with his team and discovered the scattered evidence. This finally convinced Satch that Frank was innocent. At this point, Frank had fled to an abandoned dock. Taking advantage of Jack's distraction, Frank pulled him into the water. Using his skills as a firefighter, Frank quickly overpowered Jack underwater. After waiting for a while and not seeing Jack resurface, Frank climbed out. Satch arrived just then. When Frank returned, the police did not find Jack's body in the water. Back home, Frank immediately began repairing the broken radio. 30 years into the future, John was looking up at the aurora. He didn't know if it was the solar flare that had allowed him to accidentally contact his father, and he didn't know if he would have another chance to talk to him. At this moment, the radio was gradually being restored by Frank's work. When John got home, he heard his father's voice again. Frank told John he had taken care of the killer, but John felt something was wrong. If the killer was dead, why was his mother still missing from their family photo? And he didn't have any memories of his mother being alive. As John was puzzled, suddenly, the elderly Jack rushed over and punched him to the ground. At the same time, Frank was also attacked by the younger Jack. In an instant, both were ambushed by young and old Jack respectively. The young Jack then tied up the unconscious Frank and prepared to murder Julia. The screams attracted young John's attention. At this moment, on the other side, John and the elderly Jack were fighting fiercely, and the gunshots through the radio directly woke Frank. He used his foot to hook the tools and then unlocked the handcuffs. Seeing young John, the young Jack changed his target, knocking out Julia and preparing to take young John away. Luckily, Frank, having freed himself, picked up a weapon and aimed at Jack. Jack could only use young John as a shield, threatening Frank to put down the weapon. Meanwhile, the elderly Jack had also subdued John. Just as the elderly Jack said goodbye to John, his voice suddenly came through the radio to the young Jack's ears. During the young Jack's moment of distraction, Julia's sudden attack saved young John. In an instant, the older Jack's side has changed. his palm first slowly disappeared. As the young Jack fled, the room of the elderly Jack underwent a drastic change. Before the elderly Jack could react, a gun barrel suddenly appeared. Jack was killed on the spot. John then realized that it was his elderly father who had saved him. It seemed they had changed history once again. Father and son embraced each other tightly. In the end, John not only reunited with his parents but also rekindled his relationship with his girlfriend. The family lived happily together. Most importantly, John's friend Gordo followed John's advice and became Yahoo's largest shareholder. Although this was a film from 2000, it is still imitated by many works today and regarded as a masterpiece. Through a radio, it presented a deep and sincere father-son relationship to the audience. The overall storyline was not cliched but rather captivating. During the viewing, there was a strong anticipation for a happy ending. Fortunately, the director did not leave everyone disappointed. If you like it, I recommend you watch the original film. Thank you for watching. See you next time.